She didn't announce it. She didn't write it down. She simply placed one hand on her stomach, stood quietly by the window for a long moment, and then went back to work. That was how it began for most women in the 1700s, in silence and uncertainty and entirely on their own. This is a world I have spent a long time trying to reconstruct. Using modern artificial intelligence tools, I pieced together historical paintings, engravings, and written records, letters tucked inside family archives, midwives' notes, and diary entries that were never meant to be read by anyone else. These tools allow me to shift perspectives, to zoom into details, and to enter moments that were once frozen in time. What draws me to this work above all else is the women, their lives, their bodies, their quiet endurance in circumstances we can barely imagine today. So let's go back to the 1700s, to a woman who is pregnant, and to everything that means. Picture a small, low ceilinged room somewhere in England or colonial America or France. It almost doesn't matter which. The fire is burning. The light is thin. A woman is standing at a wooden table, kneading bread, her sleeves rolled to the elbow, her back already aching. She is somewhere between 20 and 30 years old. She has likely been married for a few years, and she is pregnant, possibly for the second time, possibly for the fifth. Without any reliable way to confirm a pregnancy in its early weeks, she is reading her body the way her mother taught her to read the weather. A missed cycle, a heaviness in her chest, a nausea that comes just after dawn. Without effective contraceptives, multiple pregnancies were simply normal for women of this era. Many women would carry a child to term, recover, and find themselves expecting again within months. There was no pause, no plan. The body moved on its own schedule, and a woman moved with it. She doesn't tell her husband immediately. She doesn't tell anyone. There is something in the waiting, a kind of private negotiation between hope and dread that belongs only to her, because she knows what is coming. She has seen it before. Pregnancy in the 1700s was not a private matter for very long. In close communities where families lived on top of one another and walls were thin, it was noticed. Neighbors noticed. For most women of the 18th century, visiting a friend or acquaintance who was in her lying-in period was a regular part of social life. Pregnancy and birth were woven into the texture of daily conversation. Young women grew up watching it happen around them constantly, to their mothers, their sisters, their neighbors. Letters from the period are full of these observations. Women wrote to each other in detail about who had just given birth, who was confined again, and who had been brought to bed ill. One woman wrote to her sister, cautioning her to consider herself lucky not to have had 4 children in 4 years, as another woman in their circle had. That was not cruelty. That was just fact. And the facts were sobering. 1 in 5 women died in childbirth. Infant mortality stood at around 20%. The risk of dying increased with each pregnancy beyond the 5th. Every woman carrying a child in the 1700s carried this knowledge too. It lived alongside the hope. It sat quietly in the room with her. Sarah Wesley, the wife of Methodist co-founder Charles Wesley, had clearly expressed her fears of dying in childbirth to her husband, who wrote back, trying to reassure her. She was not unusual in feeling that fear. She was simply one of the few whose words survived. Think about what it meant to go to sleep each night with that kind of uncertainty, not as abstract worry, but as lived reality. When the time was approaching, something shifted in the household. The woman began to slow down, not always by choice, but by necessity. Her body was taking up more space. Her movements became more deliberate. And quietly, the women in her life began to gather. Birth was attended by women, grandmothers, sisters, close friends, and neighbors, all present for support and practical assistance. The midwife was there too. Known throughout her community, she brought herbs and tinctures, experience, and a steady presence. She had no formal degree. Before the 18th century, midwives received no formal training, learning their skills through apprenticeship or direct experience. She had simply been in that room before, many times, and she knew what to do. When a woman reached her time, the gathering of neighbors and family could be quite significant. A temporary community forming itself around the birthing woman, centered entirely on her needs. In a world where women held very little formal power, the birthing room was one of the few spaces that belonged to them completely. No men entered. The knowledge passed between women, the decisions were made by women, and the care was given by women. There was a kind of authority in that room that existed nowhere else in their lives. But the room was also a place of intense vulnerability. Infections were common, stemming from poor understanding of hygiene. Puerperal fever, a bacterial infection occurring in the days after birth, could cause severe abdominal pain and kill within days. The women who assisted knew the signs, and they also knew there was often little they could do when things turned. The baby arrived, and if all had gone as hoped, if the labor had not been obstructed, if the fever had not taken hold, if the bleeding had stopped, a new period began. It was called the lying in. For a month after childbirth, medical and religious literature instructed new mothers to remain in bed, confined to their room, while the body recovered. This was not a rest in any comfortable sense. It was a prescribed withdrawal from the world, from her household duties, from her husband, from everything that normally demanded her attention. For once, her body was understood to belong to her alone. A temporary nurse was often hired to take over the domestic duties that the new mother could not perform. She would care for the baby, manage the household, and allow the woman to recover. In wealthier households, a wet nurse was also employed. Since upper-class women were not expected to breastfeed their own children, at the end of the lying in, the new mother was churched, a religious ceremony in which she traveled to the church to give thanks for surviving the birth. The churching marked the official end of her confinement, her formal reincorporation into society. She walked back out into her life, back to the fire, back to the table, back to the bread that needed kneading. And often, within the year, it would all begin again. When I piece together these lives from old letters and engravings, what strikes me most is not the danger, though it was very real, it's the continuity, the way these women kept going. Sarah Stostar, a woman in colonial Connecticut, gave birth 13 times between 1738 and 1762, including a set of triplets, and while her husband was away at war, while half of her children preceded her in death. She is not celebrated anywhere. She left behind no famous work, and yet the weight of what she carried, physically and emotionally, across 24 years of her life, is almost impossible to measure. These were not exceptional women. They were ordinary women, living ordinary lives in extraordinary conditions. They didn't choose the risks. They had no tools to reduce them. They simply kept moving forward because there was no alternative. In epidemic years, puerperal fever killed as many as 20% of new mothers in major European cities in a single year. And still women gave birth. Still the women gathered. Still the midwife came. What has changed since then is enormous. Modern medicine, sanitation, prenatal care, and access to emergency intervention have transformed pregnancy from a frequently fatal event into something that, for many people in many parts of the world, is survivable and even joyful. Maternal death rates today are a fraction of what they were in the 1700s. That is real progress. That matters. And yet, what has not changed is also worth noting. The fear still exists. The vulnerability still exists. The way a woman must navigate her body and the expectations placed on it, in silence, in negotiation with forces larger than herself, that thread has not fully broken. The women of the 1700s didn't leave us their names, but they left us their patterns, written in letters, in parish records, in the histories of families that survived because they did. They endured not because history asked them to. They endured because that morning there was still bread that needed making. If there's another place and time you'd like to see reconstructed, a specific century, a specific country, a specific corner of women's history, leave it in the comments. I'll find my way there.